But if they're really good, you're like, well, I don't want to mess with it. But what if you evaluate that athlete and they have, really crappy lead hip internal rotation? So in that athlete's case, you could say, oh, well, they're self-organizing. That's what works for them. But they also don't have a choice, because if they don't have sufficient lead leg hip internal rotation, the only way they can get rotation is through their, more rotation through their spine, because they don't have it available in the hip. So what if we took that athlete and we gave them, not even like, I'm not talking about like a Cirque du Soleil performer, but gave them like average human being hip internal rotation, which is like 30 to 40 degrees. What if we were able to restore that through part training, doing like a mobility drill or, a manual therapy technique, whatever. And now we have that person swing. Their swing might change without any kind of cueing, for better or worse, but maybe for the better, because now they have that lead hip internal rotation available.
That was Doug Kechijian, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, Simply Faster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but Simply Faster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle stimulators and more. Some products of Simply Faster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in K-Box, or coaches' favorites such as GymAware. Recently, Simply Faster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill, or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make Simply Faster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Welcome to podcast 167, episode 167 of the Just Fly Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Joel Smith. Thanks for being here today. Our guest, Doug Kechijian, he is a therapist, physical therapist, coach, and owner of Resilient Training Systems. Resilience clientele includes athletes and operates from a variety of professional sports as well as military special ops and those with a history of persistent pain and extensive surgical backgrounds. Doug not only is Doug the owner of Resilient Training Systems, but he also has a background in the U.S. Air Force where he was a pararescueman. He was deployed throughout the world, and that really is something, as you'll hear on the show today, that really expanded his viewpoints and these things that allow us to get outside our own box. Not only other portions of the field, but other philosophy, other portions of just other careers in general, other portions of the world is what I'm trying to say. But Doug has a wide viewpoint on things. He spends a lot of time, and you can see this if you've heard him on other podcasts, his own podcast, his social media, just the thought process and trying to find the truth and avoiding like tribal mentalities and the mental heuristics that lead us into maybe faultily into too much of an extreme of thought process. He is introspective, humble, transparent. All these things led me to this episode today, sitting down to talk with Doug. So that being said, we're going to tackle a few things that can be very black and white in the field, very extremist, very easy to hop on one way or the other. When at the end of the day, there's a lot of shades of gray that need to be looked at with all these things, with anything. The main 2 things we're going to get to are anti-rotation training, train the core in general, or rotation training in general, and then self-organization and cueing. So letting that spectrum of letting athletes do things completely on their own versus on the other extreme, cueing and coaching every little thing? Obviously, the answer lies somewhere in the middle. We're going to get into that today in detail. And this is a really fun show with a very wise individual. And again, I just think that in an industry where it's so easy to hop on one end or the other, this is a mind expanding show. This is a get outside your bubble show. And I know Doug's thought process helps me tremendously. So I'm excited to bring you this one today. Let's get on to it. Doug, hey, so it's awesome to have you here, man. So I know last 20 years, like you've done some work in the military to physical therapy. Like that's quite an interesting transition in life. And what's the last 20 years been for you? And how has that transition worked out?
Yeah, Joel. So first of all, thanks for having me on. Really enjoy the information that you put out. So a little bit on my background. When I was in college, undergraduate, at the time, I was focused on pre-med and actually applying to medical school. And I went as far as taking the MCATs, interviewing at schools, and trying to figure out, where I wanted to go and do that. And then in the midst of that process, I found out about a job in the Air Force called Pararescue. And basically, Pararescue combines emergency medicine with military special operations. So you get to practice emergency medicine while also doing things like static line and free fall parachuting, scuba diving, technical rope rescue, extrication, which is basically like if being able to get in and out of things. So like if a helicopter crashes, the patients don't automatically present themselves to you. You need to be able to get in and out of that aircraft to access the patients and medically stabilize them. And then you get, the typical like small unit tactics, marksmanship, and combat training. So, the more I learned about that job, the more intrigued I became, to the point that I actually withdrew myself from that medical school application process, even though I was pretty deep into it. And much to my parents' dismay, enlisted in the Air Force to be a pararescueman. So going through that process, like a lot of the special operations jobs, it's pretty selective initially. And, generally because they don't want to invest a lot of time and money into training people on the technical skills, they weed people out on the front end. And the way that they do that, because, and this is, I know we're going to talk about kind of like selection, training, and talent identification. In sports, it's a lot easier to identify talent because if you're like a college football program or an NFL football program, you can watch film on somebody and you've got a pretty good sample size as to what they're capable of. Because people don't, show up to an Air Force recruiter being able to parachute and do all these combat-related skills, they've got to try to identify talent in a different way. And the way they do that is typically through, just sort of the physical and psychological challenges where, they essentially weed people out through physical exertion. And obviously you can't really differentiate the physical part from the psychological part, because the more physical discomfort you're under, then there's obviously a huge psychological component to the ability to kind of carry on with the task. So identify a lot of people on the front end with the physical part, and I'd always been interested in physical preparation, just through playing sports and throughout high school and throughout my youth. And even when I was in the medical school application process, I always felt that I wanted to do sports medicine, and just preparing myself for that selection process. It's generally pretty endurance based. There's a huge water component to it. I didn't have much of a swimming background, so I had to kind of teach myself how to swim and be somewhat technically sound, and then prepare for all these sort of mixed physical qualities. So I knew that it was something that I might want to do down the road, even after the Air Force, with regard to that, like the physical preparation component. And then just having gone through that selection process, like I said, the selection is based primarily on your physical ability. And then after that, once they've kind of eliminated the people they don't think are psychologically and physically capable of doing the follow-on training, then you go to all your technical schools where you learn how to jump, how to dive, how to do rope rescue. We did like 8 months of emergency medicine. And so the cool thing about that process was learning all those different skills. You actually get good at learning things, and you kind of learn to recognize like what constitutes good training, what's effective and what's not. And that's obviously, has a huge carryover to physical preparation and physical therapy, because the bottom line is, like in the military, you don't want to have any false confidence, especially in a special operations unit. You work in very small teams. There's not a lot of redundancy. So if something goes wrong, like you're really expected to do your job, and sometimes you have to do the job of multiple people. So there's no room for false confidence, and you need to have a preparation process that you really trust. And so, the world of sport is really no different than that. It comes down to, are you prepared to do your job or are you not? But having gone through all that technical training, like I said, you learn to recognize, what methods of learning are really effective and what aren't. And because you have skin in the game, it's not this like theoretical detached environment. Like, you're going to pretty scary places and you have to do your job there, and really whether you're prepared or not. And you're much more comfortable doing these missions if you've had good training behind you. So I think just going through that process and learning how to learn was really useful now, because a lot of professions think they're trying to solve unique problems. So with like in the sports preparation world, it's like, oh, how do you recover from a hamstring injury or an ACL tear? And these things, like, they're not necessarily new problems. It's like, were you ready to do your job in the first place, and what constitutes readiness? And I think having gone through all that training in the military and doing the job and having this constant process of debriefing and refining our tactics and refining our training, it had a huge carryover into what I do now, which is physical therapy and physical preparation. So I did originally in the Air Force, like kind of 6 to 8 years full time, and then after that I switched over to the Air National Guard, where I did I was a pararescueman part time, but even part time, that commitment was 3 to 4 months a year. So it's effectively a full time job, just because you have to remain competent at all these different skills, and doing the minimum reserve or guard requirement is not sufficient to maintain that competency. But while I was in the in the part time military, I went to physical therapy school, got my credential there, and then even started a practice after physical therapy school while still being in the working as a pararescueman. And I got out of the military little less than 3 years ago, just because it was very difficult to run my own practice and then constantly have to do all that training. I was getting pulled away for deployments, and I love the job, love the experience and the guys, but it just became too much to do both things. But the experience itself was invaluable, just because, like I said, you really learn how to learn, and because you have this really diverse skill set, you come to see the commonalities as to what constitutes sound preparation. And we were talking about David Epstein before we started recording, and David Epstein's book Range speaks to this, about how to be kind of this specialized generalist. And so in pararescue, our motto was actually jack of all trades, master of none, which that's not necessarily good or bad, but that's what we were. Like, we weren't as competent medically as like an ICU physician. We weren't as competent at jumping as a professional skydiver, but we had to be good enough at all those things to do our job. And when you prepare to be good enough at a lot of different things, you recognize certain patterns and commonalities among these diverse skill sets and these diverse fields. And I think that was invaluable, because I know that you want to talk about kind of the relationship between like strength and conditioning and physical therapy, and looking at things as more of a continuum and not these really distinct fields. And so my military experience really helped me to clarify, how do you navigate this kind of messy, complicated space.
Sure. It sounds like, a guy who was like headed to med school and then found himself in like pararescue, like very applied, obviously you were basically looking ahead at a world of probably academics for however many years, versus instantly going to something that was extremely applied and in the space of serving and helping people in I guess a medical domain. And I think a lot of things in our field, or any field, right, are often the theoretical versus just getting your hands dirty and being forced to learn on the fly. I think that those are really important aspects to anything. And so when it comes to approaching some of the debates, or some of the things that I think could become very black and white, and honestly, a lot of the things that I have for you on our question list today, like core bracing, anti-rotation, right? A lot of times I think that stuff can get very black and white. But how do you approach, like, when you go into a topic, how do you approach learning that? Like, what's some considerations and ideas that you put forth when you are going to go and dissect that?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you asked me this question even like a year ago, I probably would have had a different answer, because there's certain narratives that are very appealing, and one of them is this like reverse engineering mindset that like everything can be broken down into component parts, and you can basically just dissect this complex process into all of its constituent elements. And then if you study those elements, then you're somehow going to understand the whole better. And people, when it comes to learning, especially, they want, people love formulas, right? So if I said, well, like I read, one book a week, and I listen to a podcast, and I gave like numbers and more of like an algorithmic answer, people like that kind of stuff. But now I realize that learning is much more messy. And at this point, and this could be just because I'm in a different place in my life, and I have more of a filter for information. And maybe it took me like having more of an algorithmic approach to learning to develop the filter. But now I just kind of read whatever I'm interested in. And I mean, I could read a book on, I'm reading even more like philosophy and heuristics and things that aren't really sports preparation specific. But I can read one of those books, and it helps me to connect some dots in physical therapy or in physical preparation. But I think that there's always this range between being a specialist and a generalist. So if we're talking about like whatever it is, you said core bracing. I mean, you have to understand the biomechanics and the anatomy of that phenomenon to a degree. How deep you have to go is something that we could talk about later. But then beyond that, I think you also have to read a little bit outside your field, because I think reading outside your field is what helps you to connect dots and to see the bigger picture. Because and I've talked about this and some other things that I've done where, along the same vein of the generalist specialist debate, is tactics versus strategy. So you could be a really good tactical practitioner, and that can serve you very well. And that's the specificity aspect. Like as a physical therapist, I've got to be able to evaluate. I've got to have a decent eye for movement. I have to have decent hands. I have to know my rehab protocols, even though the protocols should be followed somewhat loosely in more of a principle-based manner. And so those are my tactics. But the strategy is much more difficult, and the strategy often can't be reverse engineered, because if we look at like the military as an example, tactics is like, okay, how do you get a 4-man team to enter a room and clear a room? Or how do we cross a danger area like a road? Or what do we do when we get ambushed or we have to react to, enemy contact? Strategy is like, how do you, first of all, what does winning in a place like Afghanistan look like? That's a very difficult question to answer, because there's social, political, economic, all these factors that influence that answer. And then you see that, once tactics become more of a strategic type thing, then it becomes much more difficult to quantify. Like I remember being in the military. The military, just like sports now, is obsessed with metrics. And you'd go to these briefings and it'd be like, well, like, IEDs or improvised explosive devices are down, this much this month, or mortar attacks are down this much this month, or there's been less enemy attacks. But does that mean that strategically you're achieving what you want to achieve? Because, for example, if units in Afghanistan stopped going out on missions, the attacks would go down because they weren't making themselves vulnerable. But does that mean that you're actually sort of winning and gaining the territory that you need, and pacifying dangerous areas? Like you can game your metrics by not even leaving the base. And if you didn't leave the base, then IED attacks would go down because you're not vulnerable to them. You're staying in your safe area. Indirect fire attacks might go down. And then, like even something like body count, right? If you watch the Ken Burns Vietnam documentary, is a great analysis of tactics versus strategy, where, the defense secretary was he came from a big data background, and he was kind of obsessed with analytics. And because of that, he liked to kind of reduce readiness or strategic evaluations to these really simple data points. And in Vietnam, the big thing was body count. So it's like, does killing more enemy mean that you're achieving your strategic objective, which in the case of Vietnam was trying to pacify this very, very dynamic political situation? So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but to say like how you learn, you have to look at the micro and you have to look at the macro, and then somehow, I don't know if there's like a proportion of each that you need, but you have to understand things, the big picture, and then, like I said, on that more micro level, and then how do you blend those things into a model that really, really allows you to see things more clearly? So I think when it comes to any kind of model and learning, you need to have you need to have a diverse viewpoint, and you need to look at things through multiple models. Because if we go and look at like physical therapy, for example, there's like this whole biomechanical versus pain science or psychosocial thing, and like those are both models. They're ways of trying to explain reality. Reality is a very complex thing that often can't be explained. Sometimes we're better at doing things and actually like articulating or understanding them. So I think you need to have some level of theoretical precision and be able to like articulate why you're doing what you're doing, but you can't lose sight of the big picture, which like our field is an applied field. You still need to be able to do things, but any model is just an attempt to explain reality, and all these models are inherently imperfect. And as long as you recognize those models as being imperfect, you can take what you need from those models and then use multiple models to try to develop a more comprehensive way of looking at something. So it's exactly like the whole Bruce Lee thing with martial arts, where he studied a bunch of different martial arts. He recognized that like boxing was great for striking, and fencing was great for footwork, and judo was great for grappling and close quarter stuff. And he kind of took what he needed to from all those things and then disregarded what was useless for his particular goals, which was kind of just more of what we would now call MMA. So I think you have to have a diverse lens or group of lenses through which you look at the world and try to explain reality. And then beyond that, I think it's also a good idea to, if you're learning something, we all have our biases, and no matter what we say, like even in science, right? Like most scientists aren't doing studies to without having some kind of an outcome in mind, or they're hoping for a certain outcome generally. Like nobody goes in blind saying, I'm not really sure what's going to happen. Any outcome that we find, I'm going to be equally satisfied with. Like we scientists and all of us, we want to prove certain things, and oftentimes, just confirm our biases. But I think it's always a good idea when you're learning something to, if you can argue sort of like your opponent's viewpoint better than they can and still come to the same conclusion, then I think then you've achieved that level of theoretical rigor. So if you're like, and this transcends into politics, right? Like if you're more right-leaning or left-leaning, like you should be able to argue the other side's position as well or better than they can. And if you still come to the same conclusion, then your argument is a little bit more robust. So I guess in summary, it really comes down to you need to know your field at a micro level and study that, but you also have to have a way to connect the dots and see the bigger picture. Because if you don't see the bigger picture, that's how you get these silos between strength and conditioning and physical therapy and sport coaches. And all these things exist more in a continuum, and we like to break things down into these neat lines because it makes it easier for us to learn and to compartmentalize things. But just because it's easy doesn't mean that it's good. Does that kind of answer your question?
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I was just thinking as you're at the end there, you were saying a little bit about like, I love the Bruce Lee example, and I love the example of just getting outside your little box and spending time in other aspects of the field or other jobs. Like even I've joked that there should be a day where like strength and conditioning has to, or a week where you have to do the athletic trainer's job or sports medicine's job. I mean, not do it, but you have to, I don't know, like maybe, and then the next rotation is you have to do sports science's job. And then the next rotation is you have to be on the field, like coaching or, like you have to. And I think that to me, I know a lot of my influence in what I do. And I think the beauty of sports performance, strength and conditioning, whatever you call it, is interdisciplinary. And I think anyone who's been around my work for a while probably sees the track and field influence and spending time as a track coach on that. But some of the things that I've been really interested lately is just dynamics of team sports and what makes a good athlete in team sports. It just not even just looking at pure on field, nothing to do with forces of the weight room. Just looking at them for what they do and everything else, and trying to dissect that and extrapolate that out. And so it's a little bit different than MMA. It's kind of, I feel like, at least for martial arts, maybe there's a little bit more cut and dried because here's all these distinctive practices. But in sports performance, it's not, I mean, there's different versions of sport, but there's also different, there's psychology and there's so many different ways that you can pull at it. So, yes, definitely. I'm very much in favor of getting outside of what we do, or really trying to spend time in the heads of other people in closely related fields to ourselves for trying to find that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said before, I mean, at this point, I just kind of read what interests me. Like I've got colleagues in the field like you who are like, "Oh, have you read this book?" And I'm like, "No." Like if someone that I trust and that I look at as a source of information is reading something, then like that oftentimes is enough of an endorsement for me to want to read a book. Or I'll listen to I just listened to a podcast, Peter Attia podcast, where he interviewed somebody who wrote a book on like healthcare systems and how how the healthcare dysfunction came to be and what the incentives are. And so, I mean, that was actually a 2.5 hour podcast, and you would think, oh, like I heard what I needed to hear in that 2.5 hours, but I'm like, wow, like I need to read the book and get this in even more depth, because, and that's one of those things where, sometimes if you give away information for free, it makes people want it more. And the more the guests talk, the more I was like, I've got to read this book, because he's only scratching the surface into what are some of the systemic constraints that make healthcare what it is, and things like lack of price transparency and some of the educational incentives and how, government regulation shapes all this stuff. And it's a very multidisciplinary thing, just like we're talking about. Because he didn't have any simple answers, it made me want to dig even deeper into the topic. So yeah, I mean, it's fun you just have to have a micro level view and a macro level view and know when to zoom in and zoom out. And as far as learning goes now, I mean, it's just, learning is supposed to be fun. So, we all learn in school a certain way where we weren't in charge of what we learned. So like we have a test and you've got to study the material that's on the test. And it in some ways it sucks the joy out of learning. Now I only have to learn what I'm interested in. So I don't actually like really think about it that much. It's in some ways it's like not even that rational. It's more of an emotional, like what's going to give me satisfaction reading, listening to, and that's what I do now. I don't have like the more like reverse engineering or algorithmic way of learning, just because that's not necessarily fun. And at this stage in my life, like, I'm running a physical therapy practice. I'm doing all these different things that, I'm reading and learning on my free time. So I don't want that to be burdensome. Like that has to be enjoyable. And the way to make it enjoyable is just to kind of sort of like go with the flow, for lack of a better term.
Sure. So first, like kind of topic of getting into all these things, of applied learning and all that. So obviously, and I think it's really cool with the range that you have and the experiences you have, and then the physical therapy take on it as well. But so, because this is a topic of performance that I look at when I hear this, I put on my track and field lens, like of performance, like throwing a javelin or something is the lens I go to. And that kind of is where I form my view. And that's the idea of like core bracing, anti-rotation, these types of training constructs for training the trunk, as opposed to maybe a more fluid dynamic model of core or trunk, whatever the word, insert word here for that area between, I guess, the pelvis and rib cage, or knees and shoulders, whatever you want to call it. But what is your take on that chunk of our field?
Yeah, so going back to like the micro versus macro level thing, I think, and this is a good question, because it's like, I think it's one of those topics that's unnecessarily controversial. It's not controversial with other body parts, but it's for whatever reason it is with the trunk. So if you look at any body part, and if we let's substitute ankle for trunk, and then people would be like, oh, this makes total sense. If you look at like the ankle, right, any joint or any body part has to have some kind of a bandwidth between stiffness and sort of pliability. And so the question is like, how much of that do you need? So I think when we talk about like anti-rotation and bracing, we're really talking about stiffness. And I think, Stuart McGill articulates this better than I can, where he talks about the need, especially in rotational sports, to have this pulse where you have this, relaxation through the trunk, the hip, whatever. And then you have this contractile pulse. And so it's basically about, you want to generate stiffness at the right time so you can apply forces in the right vectors in the right directions, and sequence these forces so that at the moment of release of an implement, whether it's a ball or a javelin, you're going to get maximal velocity at hand release so that the implement goes further. But if we look at like the ankle, right, there's a reason why pretty much every track and field coach does some kind of jumping, because everybody in track and field talks about like, okay, hip extension, but if you don't have a sufficiently stiff ankle, then when your hip is producing all those forces, if those forces are dissipated through the ankle and the ankle is not somewhat stiff and elastic, then you're kind of wasting some of that hip drive. So in the case of running, you're trying to sequence those forces so that the power or the force that's generated by the hip isn't dissipated through the ankle. So you need some degree of stiffness when you're running or when you're sprinting. But at the same time, if you don't want an ankle that doesn't move or dorsiflex at all, because then the ankle is so stiff that it can't amortize, and now you're not going to be able to access all the elastic component of the ankle joint. So you don't want zero stiffness, but then you don't want someone to be a noodle either, because if someone's a noodle through their ankle, then they don't have enough stiffness to be able to transmit those forces from the ground that were generated initially by the hip. So rotation is no different, right? Like in a rotational sport, you don't want someone who's a noodle through their trunk where they over-rotate and have no stiffness, because from a health standpoint, that's bad. Those are the people who tend to get spondies, right? They over-rotate to the point that now they're overloading those facet joints, and they're, instead of decelerating with the muscles in their trunk, they're effectively decelerating themselves at end range of spinal extension and rotation, which after a while makes the spine kind of angry. But you don't want someone who's like so stiff to the trunk that they can't rotate at all. So it always comes down to, what's the intent with these things? And I can only tell you what I do, because I think that's kind of the more honest answer. I like a lot of the Lee Taft anti-rotation stuff or stiffness stuff, because I think that for most people, something like a Palloff press, as an example, I don't know if that's really dynamic enough or challenging enough. Like for most people, just standing there on their feet or even in tall or half kneeling and pressing out a band that would otherwise rotate them is not a sufficient challenge. And I think it's, unless someone's like in a rehab setting where maybe they can't weight bear or something like that, I don't know if it has great dynamic correspondence. And you want to integrate that stiffness in a contextually specific way. So a lot of the Lee Taft stuff involves like you're moving in the frontal plane, doing some kind of like side to side movement, like either with a band in that Palloff position, or you're moving in the frontal plane, and then you're kind of doing like a fake throw when you change direction. And the application behind that is when you change direction, you don't want to over rotate, because if you over rotate, like in most sports, you want to be able to see the field, see the opponent. So if you're guarding an opponent and you go to plant your foot and change direction, if your trunk over rotates and now that person goes to cross you over, it's going to be harder to recover. So that's a case where, like in a field sport, multi-directional sport, you actually want some level of stiffness, and that's why I like some of the Lee Taft movements, because he's working on stiffness in the context of change of direction, and you're also, a lot of these athletes who Stu McGill talks about who do this pulse well, they either do it naturally well, or they're going to develop that ability by doing the task. So if it's a kickboxer, they're going to develop it by kicking. If it's a baseball player, they're going to develop it by swinging a bat. So like as far as how do I develop this, I mean, it's just like with running. If you have an 800-meter runner, you don't have them run just 800s. You want to have some amount of bandwidth to support that specific task. So an 800-meter runner is going to do some work at even like a 1 or a 200-meter pace. They're going to do some work at even their 5 or their 10K pace. And the question is, like, how much bandwidth do you need to support the specific task, which in that case is 800-meter runner. So with a rotational sport athlete, like, I want to train both ends of the spectrum. I want to train stiffness and train rotation. So I might do, at one end of the spectrum, I might do like a half kneeling windmill type drill just to develop the ability to rotate through the hips and the thoracic spine and kind of work on an end range position, but end range where you're not kind of impinging a particular joint. So because you need to have range and stiffness. So I'm going to work on the range component, and then I might do some of those like Lee Taft fake throw type drills. I mean, even things like like really heavy carries, whether you're holding it in your hand or in a zercher position, like you can develop rotational stiffness even in a more sagittal plane activity. So it doesn't always need to be plane specific, but if I'm in my practice, if I'm being totally transparent, like I'm doing both. Like I do things like fake throws. I do some Palloff variations. I have people throw medicine balls where they're actually like releasing the implement and they have to rotate. So I think you want to have the ability to do both things. You want to have that bandwidth where you have the range of motion, but you also have the stiffness. And then if you train the extremes, and as long as you're not too extreme, Now you're going to support the specific task, whether it's throwing a javelin, swinging a hockey stick, or a tennis racket, or a baseball bat. And it's a really good question because, oftentimes we do things and we don't try to articulate why we're doing them. And so this was a really good exercise for me to figure out, like, to justify why I'm doing what I'm doing. But from a practical standpoint, like, I don't do a whole lot of purely static anti-rotational drills. I like to use, more of the med ball fake throw type things where the extremities are moving very rapidly while the trunk remains stiff. Because I think that mimics what we're doing in sport a little bit better. So I am training anti-rotation, if you want to call it that, but I'm using it with things that look a little bit more dynamic than maybe what a pal-off would look like. And then if I really want to train stiffness, how people do, like, I'm not talking like light, but really, really heavy carries where they have no other choice but to reflexively brace and get stiff where they need to. I don't teach people specific bracing techniques. I don't say, like, okay, when you do a deadlift now, I want you to brace, because I think that, that people generally do that stuff reflexively well, with the caveat that you're putting them in a good position. So a lot of times, like, what we see even in, like, a deadlift is most people know not to, and this is, like, for whatever reason, this is one of those things that's controversial in PT, like, oh, spinal flexion is okay. Like, yes, it's okay to flex your spine. And under any kind of, like, heavy deadlift type movement, the spine is inevitably going to flex if you hook up sensors to them and you do a biomechanical study. But most people who lift really heavy things regularly would agree that in their setup, they're not intentionally trying to flex. They might get into a flex state, but they're trying to, be somewhere in the middle. And people hate the term, like, neutral spine because it doesn't really exist. It's a range, but we have kind of a range of what we consider, acceptable position, starting position, whether it's like in a clean or a snatch or in a deadlift. And it's going to come down to the eye test, right? So we don't want too much flexion or too much extension. It's somewhere in the middle. That's kind of what neutral means. It's like, it's this range of what we consider acceptable position. But in, like, a deadlift, an example, a lot of people, they know not to pull at end range flexion, but they'll bend over at end range spinal flexion to get to the bar. And then you'll hear the cue, like, all right, now arch your back, stick your chest out to get back to quote unquote neutral. And then, or they'll be told to brace. I would rather not start somebody off at end range flexion in the beginning of the pull, and then tell them to arch their back or to brace, because if you start somebody off in a good position, I find that those cues are often unnecessary, and I don't have, like, great data to prove that. It's more anecdotal and just the people that I've worked with. But I try to keep things as simple as possible. I don't like to use a lot of cues. I don't want to make this stuff too cognitive, and the way to do that is to be a little bit more picky about the position that people start in. And if they're starting off in a good position, I often find that bracing cues and sticking your chest out and stuff like that often isn't that necessary, because in the case of, like, a deadlift, right? Like, if you have to tell somebody to stick their chest out to get to where you want them to be, then I think oftentimes you've already failed at setting them up in a good position. You shouldn't have to cue chest out if they're already starting off in a good position. So why not just start them off where you want them to be, instead of having them go to end range flexion and then stick their chest out to get back to neutral? It's like, just start in a position where you want them to pull from, and then you don't need to constantly keep tweaking them before they pull the bar. So I know that, like, in a lot of elite lifters, they've got a setup that works for them, and they might start off in a more flex state and then, stick their chest out or arch to get back to neutral. And if these people are pulling 800 pounds and they're, winning powerlifting meets, and that works for them from a performance standpoint, like, that's fine. I'm not trying to change what they do, but most of us aren't working with that kind of an athlete. We're working with an athlete who we're using the weight room as a means to an end, not the end itself. And so from a risk reward standpoint, I just prefer to start people off in a good position, and that good is obviously, or admittedly, a subjective term, but I want to start them off in a good position so that I don't need to cue them about how to brace and make everything super cognitive, because I think that, frankly, we've made lifting weights, like, way too difficult. Like, it's not, it's not calculus, like you're picking up a weight off the floor. So just show them what you want them to look like. And, if you don't say too much and you show them what you want, they oftentimes do what it is that you want without having to say too much.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I think that gets into another question I was going to get to you. with in terms of like drills, part whole, and all that. But I did want to say I like with the whole like anti-rotation rotation thing. I love what you're saying with like the reflexive aspect and the Lee Taft and the fake throws, just because. And I even put this this kind of came to me when I was putting together a little Instagram post on like this idea of, rather than bracing the core, this idea of letting the core respond, like set the core up and then let it respond. Like that, to me, that language is where it's at. And I like the idea too, like even you compare the core to like the foot and the stiffness. Well, if you were like I was a jumper, like if I want to train my feet, I'm not going to do, I'm just not going to put myself in a neutral level of dorsiflexion and do, calf raises or just hold the calf raise isometrically at 40%. There has to be, if I'm going to do anything, it's got to be close to 100 to impact me as a jumper. And I was thinking like, if people wanted to really take that argument of anti-rotation from like, if you want to make it like total performance output, if we're not talking injury prevention, just do an overcoming isometric max and throw it in a French contrast circuit where you're like measuring club head speed or bat speed or something, like to see if applied right away that you're getting some sort of, trace potentiation that impacts that. But even outside of that, Cal Dietz said it, and I heard this 5 years ago. And well, actually, I heard it, when I was just getting into the strength and conditioning field, like 10 years ago, I read an article that someone wrote on like planks aren't necessarily going to help you in the sense of you're not going to be able to turn your abs on and glutes on and then expect like that to work athletically because it's reflexive. And that was a hard article I remember reading that like when I was 25, and I remember it being a hard article for me to read because I'm like, wait, the stuff I'm doing, like I just learned this RKC plank and I'm supposed to turn all these muscles on and I get this sick isometric. Oh wait, and that's not the way the core works in sport. And that was a hard time because that was me giving up a little bit of like what this power I hope I had. and it was also something that was hard for me to understand a little bit at the time in reading like this reflexive idea, because it was all these tools that I had no idea what they were, and I felt like I was going to be a few years away from, and having a few mentors away from finding ways to make this work. And so it's interesting like to go back and think about that. But I think about too, like in the track world, and this goes to what you were saying, like I look at like all the throws inventory, special strength exercises and general strength exercises. And I've spent some time learning a little bit about like the Bondarchuk training inventory, Anatoly Bondarchuk, and I don't see any it's always end-to-end range stuff. I haven't yet seen something where there was like a brace in the middle type thing. It was always like go end-to-end with whatever special strength tool you are using for, or same thing for javelin. You watch all those Finnish javelin training videos, or these guys who've been doing this anecdotally and pragmatically for a long time. And it's all stuff that's generally full range of motion trunk work. But that's where I'm not as sure is the bandwidth of somebody who maybe isn't is not as athletic as these guys who are throwing the javelin 70, 80, maybe 90 meters, who might have something that, like you said, might set them up for a spondy, and trying to figure that out, and trying to piece together, okay, do you need something that's a little more focused in maybe are you rotating too much? How do I know? And obviously javelin throwers are the kings of spondies, right? So maybe that was a bad example to put in there. But like, what are your thoughts on like the bandwidth of performance versus someone who, are you over rotating, and could this set you up? And do we need to take what we're doing and make it a little more controlled, so to speak? What's your take on that?
Yeah, a lot of good points there. I just want to touch on the bracing thing before I answer that, because every like intervention has unintended consequences. So all of us are well intentioned and we want to do right by our athletes. But like as an example with the bracing, if the key, as far as we know, to like rotational performance is this ability to relax and then get really stiff, this pulsation, right? Because we want to generate velocity throughout the kinetic chain, and then at the moment of impact, get really stiff. If that's what we're really chasing from a rotational performance standpoint, if we're telling people when they do these activities to deliberately brace, are we inhibiting their ability to relax, right? Because it's not so much about bracing and being stiff. It's about bracing and being stiff at the right time. And that pulsation at the time of whatever like impact or release, like people aren't deliberately saying, okay, as soon as I release this javelin, I'm going to brace my trunk. It's happening reflexively, like you said. So, but if we tell people to brace when they do a rotational activity, I think under the stress of competition and throwing an implement, they're probably not going to be able to override what they would do in their hindbrain and brace throughout the movement and inhibit what it is they're trying to do. But we just need to realize there's unintended consequences if we're telling somebody to just blindly brace in a rotational activity. That's not actually what we want from a performance standpoint. Going back to your discussion of the plank, a plank may not have great dynamic correspondence. Now, but that doesn't mean it's a reason not to do it necessarily. So, and I work with a lot of baseball players, throwers, and like there are some of these throwers, they throw like above 90 miles an hour, and they look like crap when you put them in quadruped, and it doesn't pass the eye test. Like you could see kind of I can grab the medial border of their scaps. It's almost like there's this valley or cavern between their shoulder blades, and you can have somebody go skiing between their shoulder blades. So is getting them in a better quadruped position going to like help them throw harder in a way that like you can totally correlate? I don't know, maybe not. But I think from like a bandwidth and a general health standpoint, I would, it's not too much to ask, in my opinion, of somebody who throws 90 miles an hour to be able to do a plank that looks halfway decent without a ton of lumbar extension, thoracic extension, even if we can't prove that there's a great dynamic correspondence. So as long as you have it always comes down to why are you doing what you're doing. If you're doing a plank or like one of these, more isometric type trunk movements to like throw harder, and that's your reason, well, maybe that's not a great reason. But if it's to develop some general abilities and just give somebody that bandwidth, because that comes into answering the question that you actually want me to answer, which is, how do we navigate like this range of activities? Like, how do we develop a rotational sport athlete to throw and then not develop a spondy, as an example? I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I think that conceptually what we need to do is like, you have to have the bandwidth to begin with, right? Because if you only have one way to do something, then under stress, you have no options. There's this whole, self-organization thing where there's this camp where it's like any movement that self-organizes under competition conditions is inherently good, and we shouldn't mess with what athletes do because, if they're doing it organically, then that makes it the best movement. And that may or may not be true, but I think that if it is true, there's a caveat to it, and that caveat is you want to make sure that when somebody self-organizes, say throwing a javelin, and let's say they're throwing the javelin and, to your eye, when they finish the throw, they're getting into kind of an end range spinal rotational extension position. That might be what allows them to throw hard, but if that person's never done any kind of stiffness or anti-rotational work, how do we know that if we did some of that work and then had the person throw without trying to change how they throw, how do we know that maybe if we gave them the option or the ability to decelerate better through the trunk, that they couldn't throw harder? So, when we do some of these, and it goes back to the part and whole training, we're often like, oh, if we do some of this part task training where, like an anti-rotation drill, if we do that, we're going to rob the athlete of what makes them good, which is this great rapid rotational ability. But doing a rotational drill or anti-rotational drill under very controlled conditions isn't necessarily going to carry over to when they throw. But at least if we try to develop this bandwidth or develop this movement variability, if you want to call it that, at least now when the person is under stress or competition, now at least they have options to choose from. So an example is, and going back to like a rotational sport athlete, a golfer, right? A golfer might hit the ball really far, but when you analyze their swing, you might say they're like over-rotating or overextending through their lumbar spine. But if they're really good, you're like, well, I don't want to mess with it. But what if you evaluate that athlete and they have, really crappy lead hip internal rotation? So in that athlete's case, you could say, oh, well, they're self-organizing. That's what works for them. But they also don't have a choice, because if they don't have sufficient lead leg hip internal rotation, the only way they can get rotation is through their, more rotation through their spine, because they don't have it available in the hip. So what if we took that athlete and we gave them, not even like, I'm not talking about like a Cirque du Soleil performer, but gave them like average human being hip internal rotation, which is like 30 to 40 degrees. What if we were able to restore that through part training, doing like a mobility drill or, a manual therapy technique, whatever. And now we have that person swing. Their swing might change without any kind of cueing for better or worse, but maybe for the better because now they have that lead hip internal rotation available. So I think it's dangerous to assume that any movement that we see that emerges organically is best for the athlete because it might not be a choice. So you want to give people choices and at least give them the requisite, foundational joint positions or motor tasks or motor skills so that when they do perform the complex movement, they're making a choice, so to speak, and they're not doing something out of necessity. I think there are a lot of athletes, even high-level performers that we see who they do things, well from a performance standpoint, but that's the only option they have available to them. I think our job as coaches is to give them, some bandwidth, because obviously you can go too far with it. There's always this, like kind of a conflict between rigidity and chaos. So rigidity is having no options. So that means that the movement that we see that emerges organically, it's all they can do because they lack the requisite variability in the parts that comprise the whole to do anything but what we see. The flip side of that is chaos, where it's like, okay, if you take a multi-sport or field sport athlete and you give them kind of the mobility of a ballet dancer, well, now they might not have enough stiffness to change direction and produce forces, in the rapid way that we want. So you want some bandwidth. You don't want too much or too little. I think there are a lot of athletes who don't have enough bandwidth, and we would be serving them well to give them a little bit more in training. And there are some athletes who have too much. And I think that, a lot of times the eye test works pretty well because, like, especially in baseball as an example, the reason why a lot of these people throw really hard is because, they're hypermobile up the shoulder and through the trunk, and that allows them to, generate velocity through a greater range of motion and that sort of thing. But if they're so hypermobile that, like, every time they throw, they're taking their shoulder to like a really end range position and impinging the joint and putting a lot of stress on the anterior capsule of the shoulder, now you're looking at the mechanism for labral pathology, bicep tendinopathy, those kind of things. So, there's always this fine line in sport where what makes people good can often be what puts their health at risk. So to me, like, a lot of times those athletes, baseball players in this instance, do kind of well when you give them isometric activities, and they hate it because they always want to move fast. And the only way they know how to stabilize their bodies, so to speak, is to go really fast and take their joints to these end range positions. So sometimes getting those people to slow down and learning, how to generate some tension in an isometric position, not at end range, can help them from a health standpoint. And now when they go to throw, maybe they at least have the ability to control what it is that they're doing without having to take the joint to end range. So, I'm not saying that like doing a plank or a quadruped activity is going to give them the stability they need to throw a baseball and decelerate when they're generating that kind of velocity through their arm. But if we don't try them, they don't have a prayer. So training is kind of like cooking. You have all these ingredients, and you're constantly tinkering with like what's the right amount of each ingredient so that the meal tastes good at the end. And it's this constant process of tinkering, trial and error. If I'm being honest, like, a lot of what I do is trial and error and guesswork, and you're just trying to make sure that you're not guessing to the point that you're putting the athlete at extreme risk. But anytime you do an intervention, there's a risk that it could go well or it could go poorly. And as long as you're somewhat honest with yourself and self-aware, and you let the athlete have a say in what you're doing, and you're getting feedback from the athlete, all you can do is try. But you need to have some kind of bandwidth, because if you don't have any bandwidth, then whatever you're doing, from a gross movement standpoint, might not be a choice. And I think that athletes need to have options. And the question is, what's too little options and what's too few? That to me is the real debate. The real debate is like, what's enough options? Not that anytime an athlete does something, it's inherently good because it's, the task emerged organically. I think that's a little bit simplistic.
Yeah. That's a big area that I think especially given each given sport and all the little attractor wells and how many different degrees of freedom do you want. I think that you can really get in the weeds with that stuff, but it is really important. Like it's like you said, like you have the golfer who lacks internal rotation range, and or if you're trying to swing something and you lack that, well, yeah, you can self-organize all you want, but you're going to be you're blocked by your own physiology or structure in that element. And until you do something about it, you're not going to have more options to explore what you could do without it. And there's so much. That's where even 60-minute podcast. There's just so many little nuances there that each one could be more than that in the world of trial and error behind it. I'm glad you mentioned even like with the plank, like in those types of things. And to me, I mean, I'm not just because I read that, I'm not anti-plank. The thing I've just kind of grown out of, because I do extreme iso push-up all the time with my athletes, which is a plank. A push-up is a plank. Like you can't hate on that stuff. It's the, and front and sagittal plane control is a big thing. But it's just, I just watch my language with that stuff. Like trying really hard not to say, well, turn this muscle on more, or even, hey, make your posture like this, more in the sense of like letting them feel exposure to different ranges, like different tippings. Even like if you paired extreme iso push-up or a plank with a cat cow and said, look here, feel these ranges, and expose yourself to different, feel the spine move. And now try it again and just see if that athlete can self-organize it, giving them a little direction. We like this thing of how do I give an athlete a direction with this stuff without making it like this pre-programmed universe. Like there's those athletes who's like every single thing is, okay, this position, turn on this muscle. They aren't reacting anymore. They're trying to like make something up, and that's not how sport is played. But so I think there's that bandwidth there where it's like, okay, give the athlete the environment to self-organize. That's going to lead them in the right direction. I think that's coaching, rather than, I think like you're throwing in the towel and you're saying, oh, we'll just squeeze your glutes. Like, like we'll just squeeze your abs more. Like, I mean, not that I don't think you can't do that at some point, but I just don't think that's a good practice to always be in that. Like, okay, I'm going to make you this athlete by telling you, like giving them like, or even like, I do believe that posture and position is really important. Like you have to help steer an athlete into that right position that fits the technical bandwidth, or they're going to be in trouble, but it's an art to get them there. And that's an art I'm exploring right now.
Yeah. And I think that like, that's why we can have these abstract conversations all day. And in theory, training is pretty easy. It's like, okay, let's find whatever that bandwidth needs that's required. And then the athlete can self-organize. And like that's easy to say in theory, but like what does that look like? Which is why I think the only way to really drive our professions forward is people need to share like what are you actually doing? Like what's on your piece of paper? Film a coaching session, because that's like, unless you're willing to, if you're like a stockbroker or whatever, unless you're willing to show someone else your portfolio, speaking in abstracts is often not that helpful. So that's why I think like transparency is the key to driving the field forward, because if we talk about bandwidth, okay, like what does that look like? How do you structure a training session to develop that bandwidth? And then when we start doing that, we realize how messy some of this stuff really is, because on social media, everyone is like, they want to speak in these certainties, but they're not putting their ass on the line and showing what they're doing with their athletes, because the people that are putting their ass on the line, they're not that certain because they recognize how gray this stuff really is. And I mean, I get humbled every single day in my clinic, and there are people that, I get good outcomes with, that I don't help at all, that I get bad outcomes with. And you're just constantly trying to reassess, how that happens. So this also goes back to like, if we take more of a bird's eye view and we get macro level, this is no different a conversation than, this is a popular topic now with like the election coming up. If you look at border security, right? You've got people who they speak in certainties about how we're going to develop like the ideal immigration policy. And so on the left, you have people saying, we're going to have an open border, we're going to let everybody in, and we're going to give anybody that wants to come in, even illegally, free health care. Like that's an absurd, I don't care. Like, I don't care if I offend anybody. That's an absurd policy if that's actually what people are advocating. But equally absurd is the position on the vocal people, mainly on the right, who are saying like, okay, we're just going to like build a wall around the entire country and not let anybody in. So we're basically just going to, isolate ourselves from the world. We're not going to have any kind of diversity at all. And then we're not going to have any new Americans, but for the people who are here right now. And does that mean that we should like get off the internet too and not exchange ideas with people in different countries? Like, how far do you want to take these things? So the more sometimes it can be helpful to look at things from the extreme vantage point And then when you look at the extremes, you're like, wow, that's really ridiculous, because one of those policies is the epitome of rigidity, which is like building a wall, a fortress, and letting nobody else in. The other is the epitome of chaos. Anybody who wants to come in can come in, and we're going to give them free stuff if they come in. Neither of those things are really a good policy. But then if it's like, okay, if you want to, what are you actually going to do about it? There's nobody in any political debate on the right or the left that's actually discussing what does a good policy look like, because that involves nuance and involves details. And when in a debate format, when you have 30 seconds to answer a question, how would you solve immigration? You can't answer it in 30 seconds. It's really, really hard. And so if we take the approach that like people on the right and the left, they both kind of ultimately want the same thing. They just value different things from a relative standpoint, and they might have a different way of going about it. But I don't think that anybody like wants to have a country that's being just like allowing any kind of person to come in without any vetting process. Nor do I think most people actually want the country to be totally walled off from anybody and have no diversity, but for what we have now. But what that looks like from a policy standpoint is very, very difficult, because no matter what you do from a policy standpoint, there's always going to be a compromise. When you favor one thing, you're doing it at the expense of something else. And the only way to know if something is working is to try it and tinker and be transparent about the fact that like you're not doing it perfectly and you never will, but you have to continually reflect and try to improve over time. Training is no different. If we take the position that all we're going to do is part training is the epitome of building the wall, not letting anybody in. That's very rigid. It doesn't carry over to the dynamic, chaotic nature of sport. But if we say all we're going to do is play short-sighted games, and then we're not going to do any kind of part training, we're just going to look at the whole task, and however somebody self-organizes, we're going to pat them on the back and say, great job. Like neither of those things are actually that good. So we have to figure out like, all right, what's the blend between those two things? And the only way to do that and evolve as a profession is to, all right, like what are you actually doing? Show me how you're doing both, and just think and reflect collectively and not speak in these absolutes. Because that's the most dangerous thing, is having certainty about a complex phenomenon, whether it's like politically or talking about training. Like, and that's kind of what our informational climate and social media incentivizes now. Everything is a competition for attention. And it's easier to get attention when you take an extreme position versus saying, wow, like I'm not really sure, this is complicated, it involves trial and error and nuance, and having a more honest collective conversation. That's not what the incentives are right now. So hopefully things get a little bit more moderate, because I don't think that the current way that we disseminate and share information right now is conducive to really advancing the profession.
Yeah, I think what gets likes on social media has never been a good marker of what's actually going to lead us in the right direction in finding the answer in any field.
Right.
It's always it's just not the dynamic. But I think maybe this is something we had talked about even before the podcast. But like esoteric stuff, like stuff that's almost more in the air. It's not. The grounding of it all is always the nuts and bolts and the results and what you're doing and the before and after videos and the the stage by stage progressions. And even in something like the strength conditioning sports performance industry, unless we are directly tied to the skill, the transformation of skill as these athletes are going through the system, it's a lot of it is esoteric. Like, it's hard necessarily, I think, to have a conversation on anti-rotation and core bracing if you're not showing before and afters of do you have data on injury rates on a team, and even that can be a little bit muddy, I think. Or do you have like bat speeds or club head speeds, or do you have show this person serving a tennis racket and or hitting? Did it have an impact? I like things that Jeremy Frisch has said on using Dan Paff's general strength circuits and seeing technique organically improve because athletes have been exposed to all these other movements. Granted, that's hard to quantify if you're trying to make like a, I believe it 100%. And I think that is amazing. Like that's where I want to go with so much stuff. But it's also can be a little hard to quantify exactly what of that, it's like, what of that general strength specifically, right? But ultimately, like the proof is in the pudding. And I think the fact, I like where a lot of people are headed. There's a lot of like sports performance people heading to sports skill, like people getting into baseball, like pitching coaching or skill coaching. And I think that's like awesome, because now everything you do, you can pin it right to Like, okay, here's the before, here's the after. Like, done. Like, here's what we did. And it just makes it so much easier to put that grounding on the whole thing. Like, and now we have something that's more concrete that we can keep revolving our talks around. And I think the more that happens, I think the more it'll help us all in the direction we're headed, And so, yeah, because it's easy to, even if I'm having a conversation with someone just in the weight room about not pre-programming and not overly trying to activate all these muscles and not feeding too many internal cues. Well, if it's just the sake of a clean, you're not like reacting to anything. I mean, technically you can react to your own body and timing clocks if you're really going to get complicated, which I have after so many years of this, but there's got to be something that's concrete that we're seeing before and after, I believe.
Yeah, for sure. And like you mentioned, even like the internal and external cues thing, it's like there's this very binary debate about what's better, internal or external. And it comes down to like, what's your intent? What are you trying to achieve during the coaching session? And whatever cue helps you achieve that intent was a good cue. Mm-hmm. So I don't even think it needs to be that binary. I mean, like when I coach an athlete at this point, like I don't say to myself, like, is the cue that I gave somebody an internal or an external one? Like I actually, at this point, I probably forgot what the distinction even is. You're talking to a human being and you're communicating, and you're trying to communicate in a way that resonates with the person you're talking to. And so whatever metaphor, analogy, or description you have to use to get that outcome is like what I would do. But again, it comes down to like, we like to make things very binary. And I don't know if it is that binary, because I've seen, different people respond to different things. And if you do a study and the study shows, on the whole or on average, in X situation, people respond to this style of cueing. Well, what if you're working with one of the athletes, the 30% of the people in the study that doesn't respond to that kind of cue? So you have to be adaptable as a coach, and you basically have to use whatever cue is going to get the desire that you want. And if you have an end stage in mind, then you just take that end stage, and whatever it takes to get you from point A to point B is a good cue. So again, I think we kind of overcomplicate this stuff because we like tribes and we like to be certain. But a lot of this stuff is very, very ambiguous. So I'm not saying that like people shouldn't read motor learning research and read about cueing, but just recognize that it's a model that has limitations. And in any of these studies, the studies are performed under a very, rigid set of constraints, and those constraints might not be the same constraints that you operate under. So try to, take some of the principles from it, but you don't have to blindly adhere to any of these models.
Yeah, it's ultimately at the end of the day, it's what works and what works for the athlete. I think even with the cueing thing, and I mentioned this to you before, the thing that does, like, I'm always looking at, did they do what I guess I was trying to get them to do, but also there's a lot, I think, quality behind that, or like the idea behind the very intellectual athletes, like, just tell me where to, put this limb in space. Like, it's almost like they're seeking internal cues, like they're seeking what to do.
Yeah.
Versus the athlete who just wants to go play and feel and react, and they're naturally reflexive and feeding to that engine. Because to me, I'm like, well, I want all athletes to be that reflexive athlete, that more natural athlete, if you will. But it gets a little muddy when it's like you're trying to help athletes self-organize without necessarily saying it, but they just can't do it. And it's like, or even like I've mentioned, like that say where it's like, and there's so many different contexts to everything too. I wasn't there for all this, the study mechanics, but like the idea that the athletes that could just throw the discus, and we're just told how far they threw rather than getting coached, and a group of athletes who got coached, the coached athletes initially threw farther with the cueing systems. And I don't know what those cueing systems were either, but self-organized athletes actually eventually surpassed in the long. It can be just it can be, I feel like just the details are so everything. It can get so individual.
Yes.
But it is really the individual nature. Like it's just so what it comes down to, and just being able to operate under that. So, but like the shows where we leave on, it depends, can be, it's eye opening, right? But like, it's always, to me, it's always about those, it is always about the nuts and bolts and getting down to the end result of things.
Yeah. And that's why I like when people say, they're not satisfied. It depends. Well, then, I'm not speaking to like you, because we're speaking more generally. But like if you don't want an it depends answer, then give me a better question where you're like spelling out like these are all the constraints and the details, and then it won't depend. Then I'll tell you what I would do. So a lot of times people aren't satisfied with it depends, but they're not asking detailed enough questions and providing enough information for someone to take a really, really like hard stance. But as far as the queuing thing goes, I mean, and this is just my bias. Like, I want to use the simplest queue that I can to get the desired result. Because I work with so many people, even like if I work with an accountant who comes in and is like, well, when I deadlift, I feel it more in my QL than and they're naming all these muscles and it's like an anatomy lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Like and this is maybe my bias. I'm like, wow, another provider screwed them up and made them way too aware. The fact that like this
I agree with that.
accountant knows more about anatomy than me. So I'm not saying that like you don't want athletes to be aware of what they're feeling and maybe what body parts are working relative to others. But I think that knowing more about anatomy than me, or like using more muscle-centric explanations than I would even to a colleague, I think that's probably too much information. So even people who are like analytical, they don't necessarily want or need more information than is necessary. They just want sufficient information. So again, it depends. Like what is sufficient? I think a lot of people, especially like physios, because they want to show people how much they know, they overdo it with the anatomical explanations. And I think that, unless you're really certain of something, the more you say, the more you can get yourself in trouble because of the unintended consequences. And you can make people too aware. And if we were right and we were certain about like what we were saying was true, then sure, we can give all these details. But a lot of what we're saying, we're just guessing and we don't know anyway. So we're better off saying less so we don't incriminate ourselves, in my opinion.
Yeah. I agree. I think the excess anatomy and excess data and excess like scientific studies come out when there is a little bit of a lack of knowledge about the actual workings of the thing.
Yes.
That's what a lot of stuff comes out.
Just say like, I'm not sure. This is like kind of my best. Just be honest. Like, hey, in my experience, which nobody wants to hear, like, I can't articulate why, but I think this is what we should do. Hopefully you trust me. If you don't, I understand, but I can't, I'm not going to give you false certainty either.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely, it's an interesting world with, but it's a good world. Yeah, I think we're all learning more and able to me, like the more we can come together and focus on what we have in common and how to make that better and then always bringing it back to the result. I just think the more this field will move forward over time.
Yeah. But you know what, like this is like, these kind of conversations are a good place to start.
Yeah, I agree. Doug. Well, hey, I think that's all the time we have for our show today. But thank you so much for being on. Thanks for spending the morning chatting with me. Enjoyed chatting with you. So have a good one, man.
Yeah, you too. And thanks for making me think about these things a little bit harder.
All right. Thanks for being with us for another show. Appreciate you guys being here. Appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the show, enjoy what we're doing, you can support us by heading over to iTunes, Stitcher, leaving us a rating review. Would totally appreciate that. Thanks to our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. They have been a long-time sponsor to us and are doing awesome things. Their customer service is second to none, so be sure to check them out. We will be back next week with a incredible roundtable. I haven't done a roundtable of 3 in a while. You guys are going to like that one, so stay tuned for next Thursday. Have a good one.